The summer sun hung heavy in the sky, drenching the neighborhood pool in golden light. Laughter and splashes filled the air, the scent of sunscreen and chlorine mingling like an unspoken promise of a carefree afternoon. Children shrieked as they cannonballed into the deep end, parents lounged on striped deck chairs, and lifeguards perched on their high seats, scanning the water with lazy authority. It was a scene that should have felt welcoming, familiar, a shared retreat from the sweltering heat. But for 15-year-old Jaden Carter, the atmosphere had an edge to it, a sharpness that cut through the illusion of summer ease. He felt it the moment he stepped onto the pool deck, an almost imperceptible shift in energy, the way conversation softened, how certain eyes lingered a second too long. It wasn't new. He had grown used to the way some spaces, despite their public access, came with an unspoken question. Why are you here? Jaden adjusted his goggles, pretending not to notice. He was here because it was his right to be, because it was a public pool and it was a free afternoon, and he wanted to swim, just like everyone else. He wasn't about to let a few curious stares dictate his day. He exhaled and stepped toward the pool's edge, his reflection rippling across the surface. He had always loved the water, the way it made everything weightless and quiet. It was one of the few places where the world's noise faded, where he could just be, "Excuse me, but you don't belong here." The voice was sharp, cutting through the summer air like a blade. Jaden turned, his stomach tightening as he faced the speaker. A woman, probably in her late 40s, dressed in an expensive one-piece with a wide-brimmed sun hat shading her face. She stood with rigid authority, her arms crossed over her chest. Her expression was tight, disapproving. A few people nearby turned to watch. The lifeguard hesitated but didn't intervene. The air grew thick, suffocating. Jaden's fingers curled into fists at his sides. He knew exactly what was coming. "I'm sorry," he said, keeping his voice steady. "You heard me." The woman, Karen, as Jaden instantly labeled her in his mind, glanced around, as if expecting agreement from the other pool-goers. Some averted their eyes, others watched in silent curiosity. "This pool is for residents and guests only." Jaden held her gaze. "I am a resident." Karen's lips pursed, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. She adjusted her sunglasses, as though trying to shield herself from the possibility of being wrong. "Whose guest are you?" Jaden clenched his jaw. He knew this game. The subtle, prodding, the demand for proof that didn't seem necessary for anyone else. His heart pounded in his ears, but he refused to back down. "I live here," he repeated. Karen scoffed. "Oh, really? Where?" Jaden exhaled slowly, keeping his expression neutral. He shouldn't have to explain himself. No one else was being interrogated, but he also knew that pushing back too hard, too fast, would only make things worse. "Harbor Lane," he said finally, naming the street just 2 blocks down. Karen blinked, then let out a disbelieving laugh. "I don't think so." She shook her head, as if he'd just told her the sky was green. "You need to leave, young man. I won't ask again." Jaden swallowed the frustration bubbling in his chest. His pulse thrummed with a mix of anger and disbelief. He could feel the weight of the onlookers' gazes, the way some seemed uncomfortable, others intrigued, and then Karen turned, waving toward the lifeguard stand. "Excuse me, can we get some help here? This boy is trespassing." The lifeguard hesitated, clearly unsure. But before Jaden could decide his next move, a voice rang out from across the deck. A voice that made Karen freeze mid-motion. "Jaden? What's going on here?" It was warm, familiar, and carried the kind of authority that could silence a room without needing to raise in volume. Jaden turned toward the entrance, relief washing over him at the sight of his mother stepping onto the pool deck. But it wasn't just his mother. It was Governor Elaine Carter, the woman who had been on TV just last week signing new policies into law, The woman whose name was plastered across campaign signs. The woman who, despite every political battle, had never once stopped being his mother first. Karen's face drained of color. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted. For a moment, the entire pool deck seemed to hold its breath. The rhythmic splashing of swimmers dulled, conversations stilled, and all eyes shifted to the woman striding toward them. Governor Elaine Carter wasn't just a politician. She was a force. Standing at 5'11", with sharp brown eyes that missed nothing, she carried herself with the unwavering confidence of someone used to commanding rooms filled with people who underestimated her. But right now, she wasn't here to debate policy or field press questions. She was here as Jaden's mother. Jaden saw the exact moment Karen recognized her. The woman's face twitched, her jaw tightening as if she were trying to stop herself from reacting. She swallowed, fingers gripping the sides of her sun hat. Elaine's gaze flicked from Karen to Jaden, scanning his face. He knew she was assessing, processing, reading between the lines, like she always did. It was a skill she had honed over years of navigating backhanded comments and strategic power plays. First as a young black woman in law school, then in courtrooms, and now in the highest office in the state. "Jaden," she prompted again, her voice even. He swallowed, his throat dry. His mother didn't yell, she didn't have to. She operated with precision, every word intentional. It was something he both admired and found exhausting, because it meant she expected the same level of control from him. Karen was the first to break the silence, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "Oh, Governor Carter, I didn't realize." Elaine's eyebrows lifted slightly, a silent question hanging in the air. Karen cleared her throat, shifting uncomfortably. "There was just a bit of confusion," she said, glancing toward the lifeguard as if hoping for backup. I wasn't aware that your son was—" "My son what?" Elaine asked, her voice still calm. But there was an edge now, the kind that made people nervous. Jaden knew that tone well. He had heard it at fundraising events when donors tried to mask their skepticism. He had seen it during press conferences, when reporters asked veiled questions about whether a black woman could effectively lead their state. It was the tone of someone who had spent a lifetime dismantling other people's assumptions, brick by ignorant brick. Karen hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I thought he was lost." Jaden almost laughed. Lost? What kind of excuse was that? He wasn't 5 years old, wandering into the wrong backyard. Elaine nodded slowly, as if she were giving Karen space to dig her own grave. "I see." Karen floundered, eyes darting around. "It was just a misunderstanding," she said quickly. "I mean, with the neighborhood rules and all, My son lives here," Elaine interrupted. And though her tone remained measured, the shift was palpably. "So, unless there's a policy that applies only to him, I suggest you move along." Karen's face burned red, but she knew she had lost. She muttered something under her breath, then turned sharply and stalked away, disappearing into the crowd of onlookers who had been pretending not to listen. The moment she was gone, Jaden let out a slow breath, tension still coiled in his chest. "You good?" his mom asked, finally looking at him fully. He nodded, but he knew she could tell he wasn't. She sighed, pressing her lips together. "This isn't the first time, is it?" He wanted to say no, that it was fine, that she didn't need to worry, but the words stuck in his throat. He had dealt with this kind of thing before, more times than he cared to count. The sideways glances at the country club, the security guard at the mall who had followed him and his friends for no reason, the teacher in middle school who had asked in front of the whole class if his real parents had been educated. He had learned how to pick his battles, how to swallow the frustration, how to smile just enough to be non-threatening, but not so much that it felt like begging, but it was different when it happened here. In his own neighborhood, Elaine studied him for a long moment. Then, without another word, she turned to the lifeguard, who was still awkwardly standing by. "Did you say anything when she confronted him?" The young man shifted, clearly uncomfortable. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't know if he..." He stopped himself before finishing the sentence. Elaine exhaled, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Do better next time," she said simply, then turned back to Jayden. "Come on," she said. "Let's walk." Jayden followed her out of the pool area, his heart still pounding. They stopped near a row of shaded picnic tables, where the sounds of the pool were distant but still present. She leaned against the table, crossing her arms. "Talk to me." Jayden stared at the ground, then shrugged. "It's whatever," Elaine sighed. "Jayden." He clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling up. "It's just..." He exhaled sharply. "I hate that this is normal. That I knew it was going to happen the second I walked in. That it always happens." His mother's expression softened. "I know." "No, you don't," he shot back, then immediately regretted it. He rubbed a hand over his face. "Sorry, It's okay." She gave him a small, sad smile. "But I do know more than you think." He wanted to believe that. He really did. But it was different for her. She was the governor. People had to respect her, even if they didn't want to. He was just some kid at the pool. Elaine seemed to read his thoughts because she sighed and reached out, squeezing his shoulder. "Listen to me. The world is going to keep trying to put you in a box, to tell you where you can and can't go, to make you feel like you don't belong." Jayden swallowed hard. "You don't let them." He nodded, but something in his chest still felt heavy. Elaine studied him, then suddenly straightened. "Come on," Jayden frowned. "Where?" She gave him a knowing look. "Back to the pool." His stomach twisted. "Mom, we don't shrink ourselves," she said firmly. "We don't let people make us small." He hesitated. He wanted to go home, to disappear into his room and blast music until the weight in his chest dulled. But he also knew his mother was right. Taking a deep breath, he nodded. Together, they turned back toward the pool, where the whispers hadn't quite died down, and Karen sat stiffly under her umbrella, pretending not to watch. Jayden met her gaze for half a second before dismissing her entirely, and then, with his mother at his side, he walked straight to the water's edge, where he belonged. New unresolved tension and foreshadowing. Jayden is beginning to stand his ground, but the emotional weight of the experience still lingers. Karen's reaction isn't fully resolved. Could she retaliate in some way? The lifeguard's hesitation suggests a larger systemic issue at play. Jayden is at a crossroads. Will he continue to just deal with it, or will he find his own way to push back? This keeps the tension high, while allowing space for deeper exploration in the next part. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments. Jayden's return to the pool should have felt like a victory. But as he stepped toward the water, he felt the weight of 100 silent stares pressing against his back. His mother stood beside him, radiating quiet authority, but she wouldn't always be here to step in. He wished he didn't care. Wished he could ignore it the way he had learned to ignore a lot of things, but this was different. This was his neighborhood. He slipped into the cool water, letting it swallow the tension in his chest. His strokes were sharp and controlled as he swam. To the deep end, away from the murmurs and whispers. The water was the only place where he felt weightless, where no one could corner him, demand explanations, or question his right to exist in a space. When he surfaced, gripping the edge of the pool to catch his breath, he spotted her, Karen. She hadn't left. Instead, she was sitting in her lounge chair, sunglasses perched high on her nose, fingers gripping the armrests, as though they were the only things keeping her grounded. Jaden expected her to avoid eye contact, to pretend like nothing had happened. That's what people usually did after they were caught. But Karen wasn't like most people. She wasn't backing down. She was watching, and it wasn't the kind of casual glance people gave when they were embarrassed or wanted to smooth things over. It was deliberate, calculated. Jaden's stomach clenched. He turned away, trying to shake off the unease. But the moment had shifted. Something told him this wasn't over. The next morning, Jaden woke to the sound of his mother's voice. Low and sharp, the way it was when she was upset but trying to keep her cool. He blinked groggily, rubbing his eyes as he sat up in bed. Through the thin walls of their house, he could make out the clipped edges of a conversation. Completely unacceptable, his mother was saying. A pause. No, I don't think you understand. My son was harassed. And now this? Jaden swung his legs over the side of the bed, his pulse quickening. He pushed open his door and padded toward the kitchen where Elaine stood, her phone pressed to her ear. Her face was unreadable. That wasn't a good sign. Fine, she said finally, her voice colder than he'd ever heard it. You'll be hearing from my office. She ended the call with a sharp tap of her finger. Jaden hesitated. Mom? Elaine turned to him, exhaling slowly before setting the phone down. There was a complaint filed against you, she said. Jaden frowned. What? Elaine's jaw tensed. Someone reported you to the neighborhood association. Claimed you were causing disturbances at the pool. Jaden's stomach dropped. What kind of disturbances? Elaine folded her arms, her nails tapping against her sleeve. They said you were making other residents uncomfortable, being disruptive. Jaden's hands curled into fists. That's not even true. I know, Elaine's voice was firm, and so do they. Jaden's mind reeled. He hadn't done anything. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't caused trouble. He had just existed. And that had been enough. The realization settled in his chest like a stone. He thought back to Karen, the way she had watched him, the way she had waited. She wasn't just upset that he had stayed. She was making sure he wouldn't come back. The complaint wasn't just a complaint. 2 days later, Jaden rode his bike past the pool, only to see a new sign posted at the entrance. New rules for pool access. All guests must be personally escorted by a resident at all times. Residents must carry proof of residency upon request. Failure to comply may result in revoked access. Jaden's fingers tightened on the handlebars. This wasn't about pool regulations. This was about him. He didn't know whether to be angry or exhausted. Probably both. He pulled out his phone and snapped a picture of the sign before. Pedaling home. His heart pounding. That night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind tangled in frustration. He hated that Karen had the power to do this, that she could make a complaint, change the rules, and people would listen. He wanted to fight back. But how? Then a memory surfaced. He was 10 years old, sitting in his mother's office, watching her prepare for a debate. She had been reading over notes, marking things up with a highlighter, when he had asked, "What if they don't listen?" "To you," she had smiled then, not in amusement but in understanding. "Then I make them listen." Jaden sat up in bed. He grabbed his phone, opened the picture of the new pool rules, and sent it to his mom. "Jaden, you said people listen to you. What if we make them listen to this?" A few minutes later, Elaine responded. "Elaine, I'll handle this, but I want you to think, how would you handle it?" Jaden stared at the message. Then an idea began to form. The next day at school, Jaden found himself sitting with his best friend, Malik, during lunch. "Let me get this straight," Malik said, shoving a fry into his mouth. "They changed the pool rules because of you?" "Pretty much," Jaden muttered. Malik let out a low whistle. "Damn, that's next-level petty." Jaden nodded, stirring his drink absent-mindedly. "I need to do something." Malik smirked. Like what? Sneak in at night and put dye in the water? Jaden huffed out a laugh. Tempting, but no. He hesitated. I was thinking about making it public. Malik raised an eyebrow. How public? Jaden pulled out his phone. Mom has connections. We could leak it to a journalist, maybe get some press on it. Malik let out a low whistle. Man, you're trying to start something. Jaden met his gaze. Maybe it's time someone did. That evening, as Jaden walked home, he noticed a sleek black car idling near the entrance to his neighborhood. His stomach twisted. Something about it felt wrong. He glanced at the tinted windows. Then the driver's side door opened, and Karen stepped out. Jaden froze. She wasn't wearing her usual poolside attire. Instead, she was dressed in a sharp navy blazer, her blonde hair pulled into a severe bun. She looked ready for business. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then she smiled, tight and thin. "Jaden," she said smoothly, her voice devoid of the condescension from before. "We should talk." Jaden's heart pounded. This wasn't over, not even close, and whatever Karen had planned next, he had a feeling it was going to be worse. Jaden's pulse hammered in his chest as Karen's smile stretched across her face, sharp and cold, like a blade. She stood in front of him, blocking his path, the black car gleaming behind her under the harsh streetlight. "I think we should talk, Jaden," she repeated, her voice smooth, calculated. "Before this gets out of hand." He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. Out of hand? What was she implying? His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. He had always been able to handle confrontation, but this felt different. This wasn't just a simple complaint. Karen had made sure of that. "Look," he said, trying to steady his breath. "I don't know what your problem is, but I'm not backing down. You've already tried to get me kicked out of the pool, and now you're threatening me with more." Karen's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, Jaden, this isn't a threat." She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the pavement with each step. "This is just the beginning." Jaden took a step back, his feet scraping against the asphalt as he tried to keep his ground. "What are you talking about?" Karen's eyes glinted, and for a moment Jaden saw something much darker in them. "I know all about your little plan to make this public," she said, her voice lowering to a menacing whisper. "I've already made sure your little story won't go anywhere. No one cares about some kid trying to cause trouble at the pool." Jaden felt a sick feeling rise in his stomach. Had she been watching him? Did she know everything? Was she already one step ahead? "You won't get away with this," Jaden shot back, his voice trembling with anger. He wasn't sure where the courage came from, but he refused to show fear. Karen chuckled darkly, the sound echoing in the silence of the street. "I think you'll find I always get what I want." Before Jaden could respond, Karen raised her hand, her fingers snapping sharply. A moment later, a man stepped out of the car, tall, broad-shouldered, with a grim expression on his face. Jaden's heart skipped. Who was this guy? Karen's smile widened as she noticed Jaden's nervous glance. "This is Michael," she said smoothly, nodding toward the man. "He's someone who ensures things go according to plan. Isn't that right, Michael?" Michael's gaze was cold as he looked at Jaden, his expression unreadable. "Everything's already been set in motion," he said, his voice low and menacing. "There's no stopping it now." Jaden's stomach churned. He had no idea what Karen had done, but it was clear she wasn't just playing petty games anymore. This was bigger, much bigger. He tried to stay calm, but the growing realization gnawed at him. This wasn't just about the pool. Karen wasn't just some angry neighbor. She was trying to control him, his every move, his future. "What did you do?" Jaden demanded, his voice strained but firm. Karen didn't respond at first, simply watching him with an air of satisfaction. Then she finally spoke, her voice dripping with malice. "I've made sure you won't be welcome anywhere anymore. Your reputation, It's already being ruined as we speak. People are already starting to question your behavior, Jaden. They're starting to wonder if you're really the good kid they thought you were. A cold chill washed over Jaden. She was trying to destroy him, to make sure no one would believe him, no one would stand by him. "Don't do this," Jaden said quietly, feeling a knot form in his throat. He hadn't felt fear like this before. Not real, soul-deep fear. This was a level of cruelty he hadn't anticipated. Karen's smile only deepened. "It's already done. It's out of your hands now." The tension in the air thickened, and Jaden felt like he couldn't breathe. He glanced around, but the street was deserted. No one could help him now. He was completely alone in this fight. "You're wrong," Jaden whispered, trying to summon some strength. "I'm not going to let you win." At that moment, something inside him snapped. The feeling of helplessness, the suffocating pressure, he couldn't let it control him anymore. His mother's words echoed in his mind, "Make them listen." Before he could act on his newfound resolve, Karen's voice sliced through the air again. "You're not going anywhere, Jaden. Not unless you want to make things worse for yourself." She raised her hand and gestured to Michael, who took a step forward. Jaden could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The fear tried to take over, but he fought it down. He wasn't going to let them intimidate him any longer. "No," he said, taking a deep breath. "I'm not afraid of you. Not anymore." For a split second, Michael hesitated, but only for a moment. Then, without warning, he lunged forward, grabbing Jaden's arm in a firm grip. Jaden's heart skipped, and the sudden jolt of panic surged through him. "Let go of me!" Jaden shouted, his voice breaking. Michael didn't flinch. He just tightened his hold, pulling Jaden toward the black car. Karen watched the scene unfold, her expression still cold and calculating. She said nothing, only observing with an unsettling stillness. In that moment, Jaden felt completely powerless. He was being dragged along, his freedom slipping through his fingers as Michael's grip tightened. His thoughts raced. He needed to get out of this, needed to find a way to fight back. But just as Jaden opened his mouth to shout, a voice called out from behind him. "Let him go." Jaden froze. The voice was familiar. He turned slowly, and his breath caught in his throat. Standing in the distance, framed by the glow of a street lamp, was his mother, Elaine. She was walking toward him, her posture straight and unyielding, a force of quiet strength. She wasn't just walking, she was marching. The fear in Jaden's chest began to melt away as a wave of relief washed over him. His mother was here. She was always here. "Elaine," Karen said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "You're always so quick to play the hero, aren't you?" Elaine didn't respond right away. She just kept walking, every step deliberate. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, Karen, but you've crossed a line this time." Jaden couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. His mother was formidable. She wasn't going to back down. But as Elaine reached them, Karen's smile faltered for a brief second. Michael was still gripping Jaden's arm, but he hesitated now, clearly unsure of what was coming next. Elaine stopped in front of them, her gaze shifting from Karen to Michael, then finally settling on Jaden. "You'll both regret this," Karen said through gritted teeth, her smile faltering as she stepped back. "But you won't have much of a choice in the matter." Elaine didn't flinch. "We'll see about that." Then in an instant everything shifted. Elaine's phone buzzed in her pocket, and her hand shot out to answer it before Karen could react. The look on Elaine's face changed in an instant. Her brows furrowed as she read the message. A heavy silence fell over them. Elaine's voice was tight as she turned to Jaden. "Get in the car now." Jaden didn't move. He couldn't. The air was thick with the tension of 1,000 unsaid words. "What's going on?" Jaden whispered, his voice barely audible. Elaine didn't answer. Instead, she pulled out a folder from her bag and handed it to him. Jaden stared down at the papers in his hands, his mind racing. whatever was in that folder. It was about to change everything. But before he could process it fully, Karen's voice rang out again, sharp and full of venom. "You think you've won," she spat. "You haven't seen the worst of it yet." And as Jaden's eyes met his mother's, the truth hit him like a freight train. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot.